Good evening, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all this evening to the fourth in a new series of lectures here at the Courtauld from the Land of Snows, the Art and Material Culture of Tibet and the Himalayas. Thank you both to the Research Forum and to the Trans-Asia's Research Cluster for hosting this event. As many of you probably know, due to the worrying situation in India at the time, we made the decision to postpone the last talk, Textiles from the Ladakh Himalayas by Dr. Malisha Ahmed, which has now been rescheduled for the 23rd of June 2025, and this will be the last talk in this series. Tonight, I am really thrilled to introduce our speaker, Dr. Louis Copplestone, for his lecture, Samye, A Transregional History of Buddhist Architecture in the Late 8th Century. Louis is the curator of Southeast Asia at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. He received a doctorate from Harvard, where his research focused on medieval Buddhist art and architecture. Before going to the V&A, he was an art history fellow in the Asian department of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Louis was a Daiwa Foundation Fellow at the Tokyo National Museum from 2015 to 2017. He holds a master's degree in Buddhist art history from the Courtauld from 2015 and a BA in the history of art and South Asian studies from SOAS, University of London, 2014. Thank you very much, Louis.
Thanks, Jordan, and thank you for inviting me to speak in this very interesting series of talks. I've enjoyed them so far, and I look forward to seeing the rest. But I think I'll start. I should share my slides. Good. So this talk grew out really of my doctoral research that was quite broadly focused on the history of Buddhist architecture from the 8th century onwards, and I focused in particular on some the connections between great monasteries built in Eastern India and into Southeast Asia. But this is a sort of development of that project to connect the dots further than I had done previously. So it's a nice opportunity to start speaking about some relatively new research for me. So the story of Buddhism's arrival in Tibet is fairly well known. It's a story that is most often told in two parts. The first part follows the first arrival of Buddhism into Tibet and its growing place amongst the elites of the emerging Tibetan Empire, particularly in the 7th and 8th centuries. And the second phase witnessed Buddhism take hold more fully across Tibetan society over subsequent centuries. And it was in that period that many of the large monastic institutions and their various lineages were established across the region. But for many, the monastery at Samye, shown here on this slide, and the subject of today's talk, is the monument to the first part of this story, the arrival of Buddhism to Tibet, and arguably for many, the first Buddhist monastic institution in Tibet. So this monastery is not only seen as a material reminder of the remarkable moment of religious and cultural transmission, but remains for historians one of the few great buildings datable to this early flourishing of Buddhism in Tibet, and datable in part to the time of the Tibetan Empire itself. So Samye is understood to have been built in the last decades of the 8th century, when it was the product of the meeting place, the meeting of the three great figures of this period: the Tibetan king, Emperor Trisong Detsen, the North Indian monk Śāntarakṣita, who more than any other figure is associated with the early history of Buddhist monasticism in Tibet, and the semi-legendary tantric ritual expert Padmasambhava, who may have been from northwest India or today's Pakistan. He's the lotus-born Padmasambhava, the precious Guru Rinpoche, whose later hagiographies eulogize him as a second Buddha. And this monastery and its foundation has become the focal point in the history of early Buddhism in Tibet. It appears on the front cover, at least in paperback, of Matthew Kapstein's History, the Tibetan Assimilation of Buddhism, because it's understood to mark a key moment in this process, the assimilation of Buddhism in Tibet. And in many ways, the construction of Samye Monastery and its later physical history and its institutional history and its place in popular and scholarly presentations of Tibet more broadly follow the twists and turns in the broad sweep of Tibetan history and its reception beyond Tibet. And the character of this monastery as a built environment, its innovative form, its allusions to cosmic scale and symmetry, which I'll discuss, and the events and stories associated with it, map onto several more general questions problems in the history and character of Buddhism in Tibet and the Tibetan Empire in particular, its relationship to worldly authority and its status as the product of a received tradition made Tibetan through translation and creative adoption. But Samye is most famous among Buddhist historians as the site of the Great Debate, or a series of debates that we're told by chronicles and histories negotiated two things. First, the debate was hosted by the King Emperor Trisong Detsen, determined the spiritual and doctrinal character of Buddhism in Tibet and its place relative to the Buddhisms of neighboring India and China. I want to try today to talk about some of this by introducing Samye Monastery through its relationship to similar temples and monasteries that were built almost simultaneously in North India and further afield in the southern seas on the island of Java in Indonesia. I'm going to argue that comparing these distant temple monasteries reveals certain specific ideas about sacred architecture that were exchanged between these places rapidly over a matter of years or decades from the 770s onwards. I'm going to try to ask, by comparing buildings, who was responsible for carrying these ideas about buildings, what this tells us about architectural production generally, and in particular, what it can tell us about Samye. And to do this, I'm going to have to summarize quite quickly three very different and individually complex building projects, and we don't have much time, so I'm going to crack on by taking us to the Chimpu Valley, a short distance, 3 miles or so from the northern bank of the Yarlung Tsangpo River in central Tibet. This is a river that flows past Samye, down through the eastern Himalayas, where it takes the name Brahmaputra before eventually meeting the sea in the Bay of Bengal, just south of Dhaka. And I want to ask what this temple complex looked like when it was first built in the late 8th century, how it was built, who built it, and why. And none of these questions can be answered in a simple way, partly because the buildings that you're seeing on the photo on the left of your screen is the product today of several rounds of damage and reconstruction. As Lobsang Tempa has recently shown in a very useful summary, the Samye complex is renovated and repaired in a significant way on at least 3 occasions since the 17th century, most recently and infamously following the Cultural Revolution of the 20th century. And written sources for this temple monastery and its foundation are in some ways no easier. The story that they tell, despite being very well known today, draws on often partial, occasionally quite late reconstructions and interpolations. And these deal with myth making, but thanks to a lot of complicated philological work, much of it undertaken at the British Library by historians like Lewis Donnet and Sam van Schaik and others, these can be read carefully to find a skeleton of events and a skeleton of skeleton casts of characters that rings true across different sources. And I'm going to try to argue the architecture itself. The Samye complex has an almost geographic quality in and of itself. It's a complex of several shrines and buildings of various kinds enclosed by a roughly circular wall, about 350 meters across. The organization of space turns on the central larger temple, which other structures and shrines circulate. A core set of 8 shrines relates to this temple through their position in the cardinal and intermediate directions. And today, 4 closed shrines, stupas, chaityas, or churtan, differentiated by shape, size, color, are found in the intermediate directions between 4 large shrines. And this is an old feature of the complex. The systematic arrangement of buildings at Samye by form, direction, and color is a consistent feature of early representations, as in the almost portrait-like cloth painting of the monastery shown here, made in the 18th century at the Newark Museum in New Jersey. And this painting in and of itself speaks of the particular cultic value that this temple held, at least in this period in early modern Tibet. But we can speak in general terms about the shape of the temples and shrines at Samye and assume that much of what we're seeing is up to a point, old forms arranged in old ways in new material. Looking at the central temple here through Sebastian Meme's brilliant drawings, we can unpick certain features that set Samye apart amongst the corpus of buildings in Tibet. And Samye is unmistakable in plan and elevation. It's unique. While later temples in Tibet may refer to it as a prototype, the architecture of the second diffusion is clearly distinct, and Samye stands in many ways alone. From a distance, the main temple at Samye appears to be a single structure formed of a flat plane with slight projections in the center rising up in tiered roofs plated in gilded sheets to a 5-part superstructure. 4 small roof turrets surround a low middle peak, reflecting in a way the arrangement of 4 colored shrines across the complex. But this temple comprises a series of nesting structures separated by narrow open walkways, oriented around a center which roughly is the place of the principal shrine, housing an image of the Buddha on the ground floor of the middle of the temple, indicated by the number 1 on Meme's plan here. The image faces east through a pillared hall and 2 surrounding galleries. These structures provide an enclosed space to walk around the middle point, following the ancient and habitual form of Buddhist devotion. And they also allow various other shrine spaces, storage, and so on. The projections in the middle of each of the sides of these encircling galleries reflect also the cardinal orientation of the temple and each shrine in the surrounding complex. And a hierarchy of access is embedded in this temple and in the complex more generally, in its sequence of enclosures, horizontally, centrifugally, and then vertically through the 3 floors of the central temple, where today 3 shrines sit one above the other. And the Buddha images correspond to its hierarchy in itself, at least the Buddha images that are present today. The 3 bodies of the Buddha, an image of Shakyamuni is found on the ground floor, Vairocana on the first floor, and Sarvavid Vairocana on the upper floor. An iconography and architecture working together to structure a gradual spiritual progress, leading from a manifest reality, the Nirmanakaya, through the revelation of an ultimate true reality, the Dharmakaya. And there's a popular understanding that this temple was designed to reflect 3 styles, the Tibetan, Indian, and Chinese, leading to its traditional name, the Temple of 3 Sorts, the Temple of 3 Kinds. All the buildings at Samye were likely first built on rough-cut stone foundations by filling wooden frames with sun-dried brick masonry and rammed earth. And it's important that this area is stone poor and with not much in the way of lumber, either to build with or to fire brick kilns. And this structure was likely then as now coated with a layer of plaster, whitewash, and broad plains of red ochre and carbon black. But for many, the significance of Samye lies in its place in the foundation of Buddhism in Tibet as the spiritual center of the Tibetan Empire, and for its particular association with the famous Tibetan king Trisong Detsen. And by the time Trisong Detsen took the throne in 750, the Tibetan Empire had already consolidated diverse groups, city-states, and small kingdoms into a vast, if unstable, polity, which between the 7th and 9th century had at times brought parts of Kashmir in the south, Kutcha and Dunhuang to the north, together into a single rule centered on the Yarlung River Valley. And the empire reached its greatest extent, as shown on this map, during the reign of Trisong Detsen, this king, roughly 750 to 800. He began to threaten the 5th Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid by pushing on the banks of the Oxus River, and famously for 2 weeks in 763 ousted the Chinese emperor from the imperial capital at Chang'an. And it may have been a Tibetan army that was at the Battle of Talas in 751 when the Abbasid army defeated that of Tang China, halting their westward expansion. And power in this vast and diverse Tibetan empire was at least rhetorically vested in the hereditary line originating in Yarlung Valley, precisely where Samye was founded. From the middle of the 8th century, in the reign of this king, Trisong Detsen, members of the imperial family and court began to mark the extent of their empire, both spatially and socially, in monumentalized events such as treaties, the awarding of privileges and imperial funerals and so on, by establishing large stone pillar inscriptions such as this one at Samye. This was likely established in the lifetime of Trisong Detsen to mark the foundation of Samye Monastery, and its text stresses the imperial family's direct support for the Buddhist institution and the place of Buddhism as a state-supporting set of practices, and enforces these things in perpetuity. In reading Michael Willis's translation, I'll read extracts. The seats for the triple gem, that's the 3 jewels, Buddhism, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, established in the temples of Rasa, becoming Lhasa, and other places, and the practice of the Buddha Dharma shall never be rejected and never be destroyed. Whatever necessities were provided, nothing shall be deducted or abrogated. And from this time forward, a resolution shall be made in accord with this by the sovereign, father, and his son, and every succeeding generation of the dynasty whatsoever. Pursuant to that, so the subversions of spoken vows shall neither arise nor be acted on, everyone, sovereign, father, son, and noble ministers, swore solemn oaths and made pledges, invoking as witnesses the gods of this world and beyond this world, and of non-human spirits. And the inscription itself refers to a detailed text of the proclamation that exists separately. The recipient of the donations or endowment alluded to in this inscription is Buddhism generally. As I say, the Buddha Dharma Sangha, referred to as the triple gem, the three jewels. And the detailed explanatory text referred to in the inscription itself seems to have been sent out across the empire, and it expands on the inscription to frame the foundation of Samye more fully in the personal, spiritual, and political life of the king Trisong Detsen. And Louis Donnet has written about this extensively. And he's shown how the authors of this text and the inscription did two things. First, they sought to cultivate the sense that the emperor was re-establishing a correct form of Buddhism. This is a repeated motif in Buddhism, Buddhist decline in its re-establishment, while simultaneously making hegemonic claims about a duty that wherever the emperor was powerful, this religion should be accepted. So the inscription clearly associates the stability of the dynastic line with the longevity of Samye and Buddhist institutions generally, or institutional Buddhism generally. And the transaction marked by this inscription, which is both financial and political, is carried over a series of other transactions between the emperor, his heir, and the noble ministers, all of these figures taking solemn oaths and pledges at the foundation of Samye to support both of these principles that are inextricably tied in this inscription. A cast iron bell at Samye remarkably dates to the same time as the stone inscription. And it's inscribed with an aspirational prayer made in the name of a Queen Gyalmo Tsen, eulogizing both King Trisong Detsen and his establishment of the Samye Monastery. Both mother and son made this bell in order to worship the three jewels of the 10 directions, and they pray that by the power of that merit, Emperor Trisong Detsen, father, son, husband, and wife may be endowed with the harmony of the 6 melodious sounds and attain supreme enlightenment. The intermingling of these various fields of activity here, empire building, dynastic relationships, and personal progress towards enlightenment, carries through in the single most extensive source we have for the foundation of Samye Monastery, and in fact any Buddhist monastery in Southern Asia until very recent times. The story of the construction and the establishment of Samye finds its fullest form in several iterations of the Testament of Ba. That's a chronicle of the aristocratic Ba family, which survives in several versions of manuscripts. The most substantial is dated to the 14th century and has been published by Pasang Wandu and Hildegard Dienberger. And for a long time, this text was thought to have been composed centuries after the events that it describes, but 20 years ago, a fragment was discovered or identified at the British Library by Sam Van Schaik and Kazushi Iwao, pushing parts of this text back to the 10th century, if not earlier. And the 6-line fragment at the British Library shown on this slide belongs to a section where an Indian monk arrives at the court of Trisong Detsen, which is important to this talk today. And although some of this story is the product of generations of retelling, it speaks to a division of labor in architectural production and the transregional character of Samye that at its foundation, that I'm arguing is identifiable through architectural comparison too. Let's first briefly summarize this story, which is subtitled The Imperial Narrative Concerning the Bringing of Buddhism to Tibet. So the narrator is appointed by Trisong Detsen to go to India and Nepal in search of Buddhism. And while there, he worships at Mahabodhi, which is the site of the Buddha's enlightenment at Bodh Gaya in southern Bihar. He visits Nalanda, also in southern Bihar, which is so he's visiting both the vital pilgrimage site of Indian Buddhism and its paradigmatic monastic institution. And while there, he meets the famous monk Śāntarakṣita and invites him back to Tibet. The monk Śāntarakṣita immediately, in various versions of this story, predicts the construction of a great temple called Samye and agrees to serve as the spiritual friend, Kalyanamitra, or personal priest to the King Emperor Trisong Detsen. They arrive in Tibet, and after an interval where the Indian monk is imprisoned and interviewed to determine that he's not up to mischief or black magic, Śāntarakṣita begins by proposing that the king builds a great temple monastery. And to do so, first he must invite Padmasambhava from Udayana. Again, this may refer to Swat in Tibet, in Pakistan. Padmasambhava is less clearly a historical figure than Śāntarakṣita, who's attested by other sources, and he takes on an increasing role in hagiographic literature in later centuries, so it's difficult to unpick what in this story relates to the 8th or 9th century and those of subsequent centuries, particularly when it comes to Padmasambhava. But the role of this tantric ritual expert in the foundation of Samye is typical of its type of a tantric ritual expert. He uses his ritual powers to subdue various troublesome and obstructive spirits and joins Śāntarakṣita and one or two unnamed divination experts from Nepal in going through the ritual procedures that precede the foundation of a temple. In several versions of this story, Padmasambhava then upsets the king and is asked to leave. And so the team of foreign experts and consultants at the court of Trisong Detsen is reduced to Śāntarakṣita and the Nepali divination experts, who proceed to examine the building site for its auspicious signs before digging the foundations, and the team climbs the nearby Mount Tapuri, where they overlook Samye, along with the emperor Trisong Detsen. Eventually, the ground is broken by the emperor himself, who dons a golden mantle and digs the site 7 times with a golden hoe with the help of 4 young noblemen. And doing so, they find small amounts of rice and barley along with very pliable clay, all of which is auspicious. But as Michael Willis has observed, in its detail, these passages seem like later interpolations. They reflect ideas that only become attested in ritual manuals by the 11th century. Once the monastery is finished by the narrator, or rather, once the monastery is finished, the narrator, who is present throughout, is ordained and given the name, he's ordained as an abbot and given the name Yeshe Wangpo, along with 100 other monks who form effectively the first monastic community in Tibet. And this text tells us, or variations of this text tell us, that the construction of Samye Monastery took 4 years between 775 and 779, towards the end of the reign of Trisong Detsen, who, it seems, died soon after. But it only touches in passing on the architecture and the layout of the temple complex. For example, when it refers to the 4 colored stupas around the central temple by telling us that they were patronized by different individually named noblemen, which if so further inscribed the social relationships at the heart of the imperial system onto this temple project. Elsewhere, it refers to a black perimeter wall with 4 gates and 4 places for dismounting from horses, providing the sacred enclosure, which is not only consistent with the architecture today, but it's also current practice in the boundary of monasteries and temples. As Eric Huntington has discussed, Samye has been imagined in various relationships with constellation of images and visualization practices over time. But he notes a general shift in these exegetical texts between the idea that the built environment relates somehow to a general image of the cosmos, which I'll talk about, towards more specific ideas about tantric Buddhist ritual diagrams, devices, the mandalas. I'll return to both of those things. It's worth noting here that the Blue Annals, a history of Tibet written by a monk in the 15th century, describes Samye Monastery in terms of a temple surrounded by islands or subcontinents. The word here, Lingchen, is ambiguous in being used to refer by analogy to parts surrounding a center, but more specifically to the continents in the Indic cosmos that surround the central axis Mount Sumeru. There's a lot that makes Samye a difficult historical subject. The written sources, even when datable to the time of the events they described, are difficult to interpret, and the physical history of the built environment, which is marked by moments of damage and reconstruction, are even more difficult to discuss historically. But the circumstances in which this temple monastery was built prompt the possibility that it can be studied beyond the traditional boundaries of Tibetan art, outside of Tibet and within a network of Buddhist institutions, buildings, and temples built in the late 8th century. The Tibetan Empire had, to be sure, a complex cultural character, and 2 of the 3 actors in the Samye story were not from Yarlung or Tibet. The Indian monk Śāntarakṣita and the semi-legendary tantric expert Padmasambhava, as well as several unnamed divination experts from Nepal, all were brought to Tibet for the purpose of founding this institution as an analog to founding Buddhism itself. So let's take this as a cue to think about the ways, what kind of information rather, about architecture this team of international experts might have brought with them and how this was assimilated on its arrival. If we move down from the Yarlung Valley to the south, if you like, following the Tsangpo River through the Himalayas, we'll arrive on the eastern side of Virendra, the barren tract, a flat alluvial plain in northern Bangladesh. When in 779, when the Samye Monastery was consecrated by Śāntarakṣita, Virendra was at the heart of an emerging Pala realm. The reigning king of this dynasty, Dharmapala, came to the throne only a few years earlier following the death of his father, Gopala, who founded the dynasty. Several centuries later, in the 11th century, this region, Virendra, the area shown in these maps, would be eulogized as the fatherland, Janakabhumi, of this family, of this dynasty, the Palas. And copperplate charters like this one, issued in the name of the Pala kings and of other dynasties across India in the period, have allowed historians to reconstruct some of the key events, the key political events in the reign of King Dharmapala. Besides ruling at a time when many of the formulas and practices of the Pala dynasty took shape and would endure for several centuries, Dharmapala's reign was also marked by his involvement in a contest for actual and rhetorical supremacy between three or more supra-regional dynastic empires spanning the Indian subcontinent. In the west, the Pratiharas; in the south, the Rashtrakutas in particular. The overlapping authority of the three main dynastic powers on the subcontinent in the last decades of the 8th century, shown on this map, made space for kinds of competition, celebration, and eulogy that we find across copperplates of each dynasty. From the 770s until around 800, the Pala king was implicated in a series of military adventures, battles fought, trophies won and lost. And historians like D.C. Sircar trace the interaction between these charters, finding, for example, a royal standard of the Pala king that was first captured by the Pratihara king, Vatsaraja, after a battle at the confluence of the Ganges and the Yamuna River, was later claimed by the Rashtrakuta king in the south. Despite the loss of this trophy, by the 790s, King Dharmapala had begun to cultivate the idea that his dynasty was supreme, at least in the north. And copper plates issued by this king make this identity clear, proclaiming him as the great king of kings, Maharaja Dhiraja, and the supreme lord, Parameshvara, as well as a supreme devotee of the Buddha, Paramasogata, in Sanskrit. Most important for me is the relationship between this king and the monumental temple monastery that was built in Virendra at the very heart of the Pala realm. For many, the complex of Bharatpur is experienced first through its vast size. Each side is 250 meters in length, and the complex forms the largest single enclosed area of Buddhist architecture in South Asia. Despite its collapse, this brick-built excavated site remains incredibly striking today. But more than its size, Bharatpur is remarkable for its coherent and ordered structure around a central point. The limits of the complex are formed by a quadrangle of almost 200 inward-facing cells, a structure that reflects a greatly expanded but essentially conventional form of Buddhist monastery in South Asia, where each cell provided the residence for a monk. The central temple interacts with the enclosure through its alignment and the cardinal directions. All inform the plan of the central temple and the position of clustered shrine cells in the quadrangle. The main temple itself is surrounded by a low enclosure wall and rises in 2 terraces up to 4 shrines looking out along the points of a compass. And no sculptures remain in these shrines, but the thick support holes in the masonry suggest that these images were once very large, perhaps made of copper alloy if not clay, brick, and plaster. The excavator of Bharatpur, K. N. Dixit, who was working in the late 1920s, was surprised to find a well-laid masonry shaft at the very middle of this temple. This space is essentially inaccessible, but a small quantity of broken pottery found beneath thick layers of sand, clay, burnt wood, and broken brick. And the central temple and the clustered shrines in its surrounding quadrangle are all provided with well-carved stone waterspouts, leading water out from the shrines to the surrounding courtyard. These are either the waters of ablution or rainwater, or both. Several clay ceilings like this one have helped historians to identify this vast monument. This small round lump of clay was likely pressed to seal the property of the monastic institution, bags of millet or rice or grain, and names the institution below the image of two deer looking in towards a wheel, referring, of course, to the Buddha's first teaching at the deer park at Sarnath. This is the image of a monastic institution, of the monastic institution, and it reads below, belonging to the community of monks of the King Dharmapala Great Monastery at Somapura. The same device appears on the copperplate charter issued in the 26th year of King Dharmapala at the Indian Museum, which has been transcribed by Furui Ryosuke. This document, which was issued several decades after the founding of Samye, constitutes something like the founding document for the King Dharmapala Great Monastery at Somapura, for Pahapur. It was issued to provide security for land endowments made by subordinates of the King Dharmapala, the Pala King Dharmapala, and connected to the monastery with his name, specifically a lesser king called Bhadranaga and his queen Sanhayika, both of whom were patrons of the institution or patrons of institutions, sub-institutions within the Royal Great Monastery, and they provided endowments to support them. In Bhadranaga's case, he established an image shrine, a Gandakuti, and in the case of Sanhayika, she established a series of cells, a Viharika, or she sponsored a series of cells referred to as Viharika. Well, it's not clear what this might refer to in the architecture today. It helps identify Pahapur both as a royal monastic institution, sharing its name with the king, and a site of shared or composite patronage, where subordinate rulers might associate themselves with the center while benefiting their own spiritual aims, being the acquisition of merit, while sponsoring secondary institutions within a complex whose chief patron was the supreme king of kings. In this way, the King Dharmapala Great Monastery was innovative both architecturally and socially. Its architects in the last decades of the 8th century integrated long-established types and forms, the residential quadrangular monastery, the stupa, and the image temple, into a single cardinally oriented and coherent complex. And socially, the Great Monastery, the Royal Great Monastery, and its internal constitution reflected the contingent formative character of the Pala Empire, often characterized as a mandala of kings, a Raja mandala, a circle of kings vying for relative authority at degrees of distance from the Lord at the center, the Mandaleshwar, the king himself. If we cross the sea now from the Bay of Bengal, hugging the coast through the Strait of Singapore, past the tip of the Malay Peninsula and down onto the island of Java, we'll find an unprecedented level of architectural activity simultaneous to those two events we've just described. New kinds of Buddhist temples were being built in central Java from the late 770s right up until the middle of the 9th century. This later phase in the 9th century is most famous for the great Buddhist monument of Borobudur. But in the last decades of the 8th century, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the boom in temple building was centered around the Opak River, further to the southeast than Borobudur, in a suburb of the modern city of Yogyakarta. And at the center of this activity was the temple complex of Chandi Sewu. The Sewu complex is made up of 250 separate shrines arranged in an organized symmetry of 4 concentric quadrangles and a central temple. The entire complex, which is bordered by a low wall, is around 180 meters aside, so smaller than both Pahapur and Samye. And unlike both those monuments, Sewu was built using a jigsaw-like system of interlocking blocks cut from the region's fine-grained volcanic stone, which has allowed archaeologists and conservators to effectively reassemble many of the collapsed structures in the complex, which is what you see today. The temple at the center of the Sewu complex has a single inner shrine facing east, set behind 4 antechambers, and these are accessible through a narrow balcony passage around the temple and leading out through the 4 staircases which project in the cardinal directions. And the superstructure of this temple brings a cluster of stupa forms at several scales and altitudes to create a hierarchy of 4 around a central larger point, an arrangement that here too reflects the 4-fold structure of the temple and is mirrored in the entire complex. As at Pahapur, the central image in the inner shrine of the main temple at Chandi Sewu is lost, but a thrown back integrated in the back wall suggests it would have been very large. During the reassembly of this temple in the 1980s, Several intentional ritual deposits were discovered in the foundations of this temple, including small mold-made clay images of stringed instruments and a ceramic bowl made in the Pearl River Delta of Guangdong in southern China, alongside fragments of charcoal. The central temple is surrounded on all sides by the 4 concentrically arranged quadrangles of smaller shrines. 6 mid-sized shrines sit between 2 sets of 2 rows of smaller shrines. And many of these have been reassembled by conservators in recent years, and the recovery of large numbers of monolithic Buddha images of a uniform size makes it clear that each shrine once housed an image of a seated Buddha, making one of the conventional gestures, the mudras, touching the earth, giving, meditating. It's not clear how these were arranged, but they don't appear to have been grouped iconographically in any consistent way. Well-carved stone drains in the form of the mythical crocodilian Makara run around the central temple and the lower wall. And as at Pahapur, these may have carried rainwater or the ritual waters of ablution into the surrounding courtyard. Masons seem to have assembled the structure of uneven interlocking bricks of blocks of stone before carving them with imagery in situ. The entire surface of every shrine and main temple is richly carved with imagery in ways that the brick-built Pahapur and the technology used in central Tibet couldn't possibly have allowed. Some of which is suggestive of patterns known from textiles that circulated in the 8th century, such as the famous animal roundel pattern, the Sogdian roundel, associated with Sogdia in today's Uzbekistan. And here I'm comparing a child's jacket of this type from the Cleveland Museum with a composition on a plane of ornament on the central temple, the exterior of the central temple at Sewu. The little that we know about the date and circumstances of the construction of Chandi Sewu depends on several stone inscriptions, and as ever, the relationship between these inscriptions and the temple is complicated, not least because this kind of stone inscription can be moved. But it seems overwhelmingly likely that these several inscriptions relate directly to the construction of this temple. The so-called Kalurak inscription was found near a village of the name 300 meters south of Chandi Sewu near a satellite temple called Lumbung. Its 20 verses are composed in Sanskrit and inscribed in the North Indian Siddhamatrika script, which was current in North and Eastern India at the time, and it gives its date in the Shaka era equivalent to 782 CE. It eulogizes the great success of a king called Indra, who takes the second name Songra Madan Anjaya Bodhisattva. He's described as an ornament of the Shailendra dynasty, a destroyer of the brave men, and it records specifically that having conquered the kings of all quarters, this king established an image of the Bodhisattva, Manjushri, for the purpose of protecting and guarding the state, the country, the Desha, from its enemies. This inscription is most famous for its reference to the role of a royal preceptor, a Rajaguru called Kumaraghosa, who came, we're told, to Java from Bengal, from Gaudi Dvipa, Gauda being an old and actually current name for Bengal. And it's possible that this Indian monk, Kumaraghosa, who like his contemporary in Tibet, Śāntarakṣita, traveled abroad specifically to provide a series of services to foreign kings, both consecrating an image of the Bodhisattva Manjushri and composing the inscription that we're looking at on screen. The connection between Kumaraghosa's inscription and Chandi Sewu becomes a little clearer when we look at another stone inscription found in the clearance of the southwestern side of the complex itself, the so-called Manjushri Griha inscription, the Temple of Manjushri inscription, the House of Manjushri inscription. Unlike the previous inscription, this one was composed in the vernacular in Old Malay and inscribed in an old Javanese script. Again, it's dated in the Shaka era, but to the equivalent of 792, a full decade after the events of Kumaraghosa's inscription. And it eulogizes a temple using the Sanskrit word prasada called the House of Manjushri. This is a Manjushri Griha, which is seen, we're told, or seen in a vision, by a Javanese nobleman who was the chief at Randa. And as Arlo Griffiths, who recently translated this or retranslated this inscription, has shown, it's difficult to know what in particular is being referred to here, but it appears that the Javanese nobleman had undertaken a bodhisattva vow, the pranidhana, that's a vow to eventually attain enlightenment in however many lives, and that this related in some way to the vision to the sight and the vision of seeing a temple housing Manjushri, which he equates in some way to the Vajrasana, which could be the seat, well, refers to the seat of the Buddha's enlightenment as that at Bodh Gaya, as the narrator of the Testament of Ba visited. So this inscription may record or commemorate a pilgrimage or a visionary practice, or perhaps more likely, the meritorious patronage at a temple to Manjushri, and perhaps at the Sewu temple complex, where a royal image of this bodhisattva was consecrated near this spot by an Indian monk only a decade before. For context, it's interesting to look at a third inscription from the emperor, from the area, the Kalasan inscription, which was inscribed 4 years before the Caloric inscription, before the Kumaragosha inscription, but is otherwise very similar. It's composed in Sanskrit and inscribed in the North Indian Siddhamatrika script, and it refers to a temple of the female bodhisattva Tara, built on the order of a guru of the Shailendra king Indra. So it tells us how this unnamed guru, I think we can assume this is also Kumaragosha, ordered this temple to be built. The temple belongs to the noble monks, but was established on the commission of the king by 3 local officials. So there's a general sense of the situation, I think, in Central Java in the 770s and 80s between these various inscriptions. Not unlike the situation at Samye or Pahapur in the same period, kings worked with Buddhist experts, often from India, to have temples built. And they did this for their own well-being and for the worldly benefits of state protection. And there is some sense here that these great temple projects provided an opportunity for the elites in both associate themselves with the spiritual aim of the king and their own spiritual aims and the authority of the king by patronizing parts of the shrines within his greater edifice. Despite the significant geographic and cultural distances between these 3 temple monastery complexes that I've described in this talk so far, there are striking and I think compelling points of similarity between them. These are not only formal or relating to specifically to the arrangement of space within each site, but are social and ideological. The picture that I hope is emerging is of a kind of quasi-political architectural activity in which, with the guidance of a Buddhist expert, a king undertakes a triumphant monumental temple project, both to mark supremacy and to substantiate it, formally through its scale by integrating subordinate authorities into the project, which is architectural and political, simultaneously, through their secondary acts of donation and patronage. But the striking level of similarity between these 3 complexes lies in their innovative spatial arrangement rather than in any particular detail of construction. In fact, the defining feature of this comparison is that the material, technologies, and indeed general style of architecture, determined by the ornament, often the ornamental surface of a building, is entirely different in each case. As I noted, the arrangement of the Samye complex alludes in some representational manner to the world system conceived in cosmographic or cosmological terms, which is alluded to even in the sources, the language of the early written sources connected to the monastery, as I said. And the cosmography at work here is generally Indic and Buddhist, and one that's clearly legible in later paintings, such as this 19th century cloth painting at the Rubin Museum. The great axis Mount Sumeru is the seat of the central heavenly palace, and the high heavens circulate around this. The worlds of the lesser gods and men emerge by degrees towards the basis, where the 4 continents are surrounded by an enclosing wall. And Eric Huntington, who's written a lot about cosmology in Indo-Tibetan context, sees this kind of cosmology as a project in its own right, rather than simply an image to be represented. Discursively, he argues the cosmos has been used to make sense of the world, the relative relations of things and practices that are implicated in core Buddhist spiritual journeys, such as towards enlightenment, merit, and rebirth. Building a microcosmos at the heart of the realm in the late 8th century, whether in Tibet, Eastern India, Northern Bangladesh, or Java, speaks to a similar project to make sense of the contingent formative process of substantiating one's political supremacy. And it's possible that a second idea or image emerges out of this arrangement too. And this is not entirely distinct to the generalized cosmology in the previous slide, the axis mountain. There's an overlap in early Buddhist tantric literature between the image of a Buddha sitting atop the cosmic Mount Sumeru, which is generally in Indic religions an image that is multi-religious, at the midst of a great, unprecedented, unfolding mandala of all beings, and the highly schematized ritual device and image of the tantric mandala, such as in this case, a mandala painted on the wall at Alchi. These tantric mandalas plot the relative relationship between Buddhas and their families of lesser enlightened beings, mapping also a progress towards enlightenment. And at some point in its history, the Samye complex began to be seen in clearly and explicitly representational terms in relation to the mandala of the Buddha Vairochana. Comparing three Buddhist temple projects like this, undertaken over a short period of decades in the late 8th century, prompts a series of questions about how architecture might have operated transregionally. Of course, buildings do not in themselves move, unlike manuscripts, paintings, or sculpture, which we know circulated extensively across long distances in this period. Information about architecture, information about building as a process, but also individual buildings, can only travel through mediators and in parts. Buildings might be packed into plans, drawings, or small models and taken long distances and then unpacked, but the process of exchange in this process of packing and unpacking significantly informs the eventual appearance of the transregional building. The role of ritual or religious experts, mostly it seems Buddhist monks working as royal preceptors, is particular to this process. These were not masons, and their interest in architecture was, broadly speaking, cultural rather than pragmatic. It focused on the memory of buildings in use, rituals being undertaken, and the motive for construction, as well as the liturgical and ritual accompaniment to these processes, rather than the stuff of masons and artisans. And the story at Samye is interesting because Śāntarakṣita has to assemble a team of experts. We find a division of labor of sorts in the architectural site, a building site at work in the late 8th century, between an overseeing ordained preceptor, Śāntarakṣita, taking on perhaps the conventional role of a Buddhist navakarmika, the renovator, a role prescribed by the Vinaya, by the old monastic rule, a tantric officiant in Padmasambhava, and several unnamed divination experts from Nepal. Implicit here is the idea that Śāntarakṣita did not know enough even about the ritual requirements of temple building to service Trisong Detsen alone. But like Kumaraghosha at the time, in the court of King Indra in central Java, Śāntarakṣita's role was presumably mostly as a consultant and a guide to his patron king. We can imagine that he advised the king to build a temple of a general kind, but perhaps couldn't tell him much more about how he would do it. Between this division of labor, we find the dichotomy again between cosmopolitan and local workforces at the temple as a building site in the late 8th century. The agents we have recorded, being cosmopolitan monk experts, worked surely with agents we hear nothing about, the artisans, the masons who circulated along different trajectories, if they circulated at all. The style of the architecture at Tandisewu is peculiar to central Java, even while it has South Indian and Central Asian motifs running through it. Other features are similar to those at Paharpur, the water spouts, for example. Architecture is complicated, and its transregional exchange assumes that parts or aspects are exchanged and circulate on distinct trajectories. A parallel here to make sense of long-distance cultural exchange is linguistic translation, where forms change or stay the same, often independent of shifts in meaning and significance. When Buddhist texts arrived in Tibet, the word of the Buddha was translated from Sanskrit, often into Tibetan. Certain parts were mantras and so forth. And in doing so, often pre-Buddhist ideas and words were repurposed to refer to newly arrived religious concepts. But the older significances lingered on, still in these new verbal constraints. The language of the inscriptions connected to the Sewu temple are interesting in this case. While the inscriptions in North Indian scripts, perhaps composed by the Indian monk Kumaraghosha, have suggested to some the wholesale transfer of Indian ideas onto a central Javanese terrain, the Old Malay inscription, composed a decade later, reminds us that below these similarities lie a rich vein of local content and significance that not only operated outside of classical Sanskrit worldview, but was deeply particular to the local context. And often this constituency remains invisible to historians. Samye Monastery remains the single most important monument from the time of the Tibetan Empire. Despite being at the center of the story, it also pushes the borders of Tibetan architecture or Buddhist, Indian, Javanese architecture as scholarly categories. From another perspective, Trisong Detsen's establishment of Samye marks his participation in a remarkably cosmopolitan and surprisingly trans-regional set of architectural practices, the construction of a royal Buddhist great institution to substantiate his universal claims, both worldly and spiritual, by recreating a cosmos at the very heart of his kingdom. And as an architectural historian and as an architectural historical subject, Transregional Buddhist architecture in the late 8th century is a further reminder to think about these buildings through those who are involved in them, where possible, and as living social projects. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Louis. That was a wonderful talk. We now have some time to take questions, and we already have our first question, so I'll go straight in with it. But if you have anything that you want to ask Louis, you can write it in the chat and we'll do our best to read them out. Kai Lun Lo has asked, in terms of the site, India and Java appear more angular, square-shaped, whereas the square in Tibet is only in the middle. Is there any significance in this aspect of the architecture?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting difference. I mean, I think that one of the features of differences the in Pahapur you have the old quadrangular monastery that's present there architecturally. So it's cells facing inwards. This is an established form in Eastern India. You see it across lots of earlier monasteries and so on. The striking thing about Pahapur is that many of those cells became shrines rather than cells. So it's kind of repurposed slightly in a way that makes it feel slightly more like what you see at Chandisewu, which is, entirely shrines and temples. But the significance, I think, is it's a point of architectural difference rather than, I think, if there's a suggestion that there's sort of difference in relation to this cosmic allusion to the cosmos. I'm not entirely sure, but it's a good question. I mean, this interesting thing about Samye architecturally is, and I've probably been lazy here because I keep referring it to it partly as a temple, partly as a monastery, but actually there's no sign architecturally of any monastic residence within the architecture as we understand it to have been there in the late 8th century. And the surrounding wall would have been a space for that if there was a full, transfer of the Indian model that you see at Pahapur, and it's in similar sites. It's an interesting question.
Okay. If anyone else has a question that they want to ask, please write it down. In the meantime, something that I thought was really interesting was when you spoke about the wall decoration, surface decoration of the temple in Java and its relationship to textiles. And I wondered if you knew of, or if you have read of any evidence that shows that the surface decoration was ever painted.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's evidence of it being plastered. There's still remains of this plaster on some of these stone temples. We don't know what point, whether that was initial or later. But if it's being plastered or whitewashed, I think we can safely imagine it might have been painted. The surface ornament, the textile surface ornament, is really interesting. I think that's a feature particular of Indonesia and Southeast Asia, in that it's very much on the trade routes by sea, and it's getting lots of textiles. It's a place of real circulation. So one of the interesting things about Sewu compared to Pahapur or a similar site at the same time is just the quantity of trade goods you find there. In the deposit, there's ceramics from China, and there's a suggestion of textiles throughout the sculpture and the architecture and the sculpture. There's a book on this by Leslie Pullen, who has talked a lot about textiles as they appear in sculpture from this period in Central Java. So it's clearly a kind of node in an exchange of textiles. It's entirely independent and peculiar to Chandisewu, peculiar to Central Java in this time.
Following your comment about the surface texture and the movement of textiles, do you think that other architectural decorations, such as the Makara water spouts, which are also found in early Tibetan architecture, do you think that that's an idea that's also circulated as well as the overall structure of these buildings?
Yeah, I think that seems to be one of the key. I mean, and that's an interesting one because it's related, though it appears kind of a stylistic feature. It's very practical. It's related to something that's practically going on. It's kind of practical technology. So that would be
Mm,
an interesting point of comparison
mm,
to find in Tibet and so on.
mm, mm.
Yeah, but
Okay,
certainly, I mean, it's a striking comparison in between Sewu and Pahapo
okay, okay,
in that case.
okay.
But I think for me, what I the kind of starting this project and thinking about it is making sense of the fact that these things circulate independently. So you might have sort of broad spatial arrangements that you find in two places simultaneously, but certain features like the Makara drains might circulate in different ways. The same is true, I suppose, for textiles and so forth.
Okay. Thank you. We have one more question, a couple more questions now. Um, Andrew Taylor has asked, is there any clash between scientific or historical investigation and the mythic explanations of the origins of these institutions, particularly of Samye?
Yeah, I mean, this is the text that everyone tends to depend on for the history of Zambia. This Testament of Ba is a really difficult text, in a way, for this reason. Less, I mean, just in the way that stories are told and retold, and they become slightly more complicated and embellished as time goes on. Um, so it's about picking, as I've tried to show in the presentation, picking between the different sources, and skeptically reading some of these, being aware to this later interpolation and grounding yourself in those, particularly in inscriptions that tend to be the most reliable,
Mm,
closest to the moment,
mm,
written sources.
mm,
But I think the mythical explanations are significant too. I mean, it's not simply the material that I'm interested in here. There's ways the stories develop and the way they are, they are fundamental to the architectural design initially is important. So I'm not trying to entirely untangle the sort of formal history of
mm,
material and the
mm,
stories told about buildings.
mm. It's certainly one of the most interesting aspects of Tibetan history is the blurring of lines between factually historical
Right.
events and
Yeah.
mythological events.
Yeah, and Padmasambhava is a classic case of that because people, and in the literature people can treat him very differently. For some historians, he's very much an historical figure, attested and can be talked about biographically. For some, he's entirely
Mm,
a much harder figure to talk about
mm.
historically. You know,
We have one more question from Tupten Sang, who said, fantastic, fascinating presentation, Louis. Will you be undertaking site-specific research in the future to fully flesh out this architectural network?
Yeah, thank you, Tupten. Yeah, I think this frustrating thing about, and it probably did come across quite clearly in the presentation, is that though I know Chandi Sewu and Pahapur very well, I've been there, I've studied these buildings. In the Samye case, I'm talking about a building I haven't been able to see myself. I haven't studied um, up close, which is sort of anxiety-inducing for an architectural historian and any scholarship. So absolutely, that would be the next step if I take this project a little bit further. So the kind of the excuse I tell myself there is that the architecture at Samye is so difficult to. It doesn't have the status as a historical source in the way that Bahapur and Chandisewu do, simply because it's been so, reconstructed and repaired. But I'd love to. The next step would be to go to Samye and around.
Just while we give people to have one last chance to write any questions, is there anything that you want to talk about regarding the methodology of looking at connecting different histories across regions in the way that you've shown in this presentation? Is there something specific to your methodology that helps to connect these different things, or is it just simply through looking at things over time and becoming familiar with different patterns yourself?
I think the key for me thinking transregionally is recognizing that buildings are complicated and travel in complex ways. There's a great if people want to read up on this, my methodology here is borrowed really from a historian of South Asian architecture called Tamara Sears, who's written about the way that forms and types travel along different routes in central India. Tamara Sears is article on river routes, and then there's several other architectural historians that I'm kind of leaning on for the methodology here.
Okay. We have a question from Nigel Warden, who's asked, do we find these architectural layouts in temples or monasteries of later periods?
What's interesting about this actually is it seems to be a very short period that we'd find this kind of cruciform arrangement in each case actually in but they all have their different sort of histories subsequently. I mean, in Eastern India, Pahapur is followed by a temple, a very similar temple monastery founded for the son of Dharmapala, Devapala, arguably. But that type of architecture ceases to be built after the middle of the 9th century,
Mm,
and you don't see it again. It's quite a short period that overlaps with the shift in royal interest in Buddhism, actually, um,
mm,
and in Central Java too. I mean, the Buddhists end their main activity in Central Java by building Borobudur, which is in some ways conceptually similar. Of course, if you've seen Borobudur, it relates somehow to the same cosmic imagery and perhaps even the mandala, but it's architecturally very different. It's an exterior, it's a stupa type structure, it doesn't have an interior space. There is a Hindu temple, a Shiva temple built right next to Chandisewu at around the same time as Borobudur that shares characteristics with it, but it's in a kind of competition with that particular building, I think. So, and in Tibet too, by the second diffusion, architecture is quite different.
mm,
There are some comparable. Toling temple is comparable, but
mm,
generally, architecture is quite different in the second diffusion.
mm. Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, Louis. That was wonderful. And thank you for speaking at the courtauld.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.